So welcome to our Hill Business Briefing webinar. Thank you all for making the time to attend. And just a few housekeeping items before we get started. One is I wanted to thank everyone for keying in their Hill Visit appointments on the Google Docs Excel spreadsheet. That really is so very helpful to me and to Kat. If you get additional appointments in the coming days, I'm not losing hope yet that you will get some appointments in the coming days. Do follow the same process and include those in that Excel spreadsheet. That's the best way to keep us on the same page. Some of you, especially those of you that will probably be viewing this as a recording, may not know Katrina McDonald, NCSS's expert on the Hill. And so let me just say a few words about Kat. She is the president of Linchpin Strategies, LLC, and that's a firm that specializes in federal legislative policy, strategy, and advocacy in the areas of education, health, and disability. Her experience on the Hill includes working for Senator Edward Kennedy on the Senate Labor Committee, staffing domestic social issues and appropriations for Congressman Steny Hoyer, and serving as the legislative director for Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro. Kat, thank you for being with us and leading this presentation in this snowy day here in Washington, D.C., when everything is closed, except that we're open. Thank you. Without further ado, here's Kat.
Hello, everyone. It's good to join you. I hope that you are warmer and drier than we are here in D.C. I shoveled a long driveway of a foot of snow this morning, and I'm getting really tired of this winter. I'd much rather be out in Southern California where I saw Michelle only a week ago, and it was 8 degrees. It seems like a very long time ago now. So I'm going to go through the legislative issues and ask for folks to be talking with members of Congress about, because that's always sort of the most anxiety-producing part of those visits. So what exactly do you want me to say and talk about? What do you think that they're going to want to hear? And we've got some sort of complicated stuff going on. So I'm going to spend time talking about the legislative issues that are before us right now. And then if folks want to pull back and talk more about the meetings, what to expect if you have never done Hill meetings before, then we can certainly talk about that as well. But first, let's dive into the topics for the conversation. And we will be getting you some talking points and some leave behinds before your meetings, but right now, let's just sort of walk through the issues. For your congressional meetings at the end of this week, I think we have 4 main goals. One is, in some offices, you're going to need to persuade people of the importance of teaching social studies. You're going to go in, and you would think that this would be an easy sell in congressional offices where, obviously, all of the members and presumably staff as well have some reason to be interested in social studies or they wouldn't be working in government. But sometimes it's a harder sell than we would think to explain to folks in the federal government why funding for and focus on teaching of the social studies is important, and why that shouldn't just be left to school districts or states to decide. The second thing that I think we want to talk about is the SEED funding and criteria, the SEED language that we got in the 2014 appropriations bill. And there are some challenges with that. And we would like to persuade congressional offices to weigh in with the Department of Education. So we'll talk about this issue and how it creates both opportunities and challenges for the social studies. And you're going to want to be a little conversant in that as you're going in to talk to congressional offices. And I know for most of you, this is a new topic. Third, we would like congressional offices to support funding for the social studies in the 2015 appropriations bill. And lastly, but not least importantly, we want to prepare congressional offices for the ESEA reauthorization, which is currently dormant and not expected to go anywhere this calendar year, but there's a possibility, especially if the Senate switches to Republican control, we could see movement on ESEA language next year. And so we want to prepare the congressional offices that we're talking to now for that reauthorization. So that was a big task, especially if you only have 15 or 20 minutes in a meeting. So let's dive in and talk about how you might do that. So on the next slide, the first thing that we need to do is talk to people about why the social studies is important. We know that there's been a lot of focus on English language and literacy, and a lot of focus on STEM. And in particular, the business community has been focused on STEM and talking about how important it is that they have enough people they can hire with math and technology skills, science skills. And I think that we can make a strong case that this is equally important in the social studies. First, I always, when I'm talking with folks, address the fact that the public schools were initially created not to help train good employees, but to help train informed citizens to participate in a democracy. And at a time when we see increasing public apathy and people who believe that government can't and won't solve their problems, and that they should not be engaged with government, they shouldn't be voting. That's an important thing to remind folks, that civic education, history, social studies in particular, geography and economics as well, are important for preparing voters to make informed decisions as part of the democratic process. We also believe that social studies teaches critical thinking skills, and those critical thinking skills are just as important to employers. Problem solving, inferential reasoning, critical reasoning are just as important to employers as math and science. So we need to make the case for the importance of civic education. You do want to adapt your pitch to your audience. So, for example, if you are going in to talk to a Tea Party office where they believe that nothing government does is as valuable and important as things that are undertaken by the volunteer sector and the private sector, then you probably don't want to be making a case for how people in a democracy need to be engaged with government so government can help solve problems. But you probably do want to talk about equipping citizens to participate in local decision-making and in making their communities a better place so that people are not always turning to government to solve problems, and how civic education can be a part of that learning process, as can history, economics, geography. Certainly, if you are talking to an office, a congressional office that is sort of isolationist, you don't want to be leading off with geography, as important as it is. You might want to lead off with American history, which is the aspect of the social studies that they are likely to think is the most important. So you want to know a little bit about the congressional office that you're going into, do a little bit of research on the member of Congress before you talk with them, and think about how to craft your message so that it's most likely to resonate in that office. Folks always love to hear local examples and details. What is going on in your community? Are students no longer required to take American history or civics as a graduation requirement in high school? Are there things that students are allowed to do, like volunteering in the school office, for example, that then get them out of a civics or American history requirement? Folks will want to know if there are things going on in your area locally that are related to teaching of the social studies, testing of the social studies, requiring students to pass social studies courses. so that they can understand what's happening in their state and in the congressional districts that they represent. And then you can also supplement that with national information. So, for example, as part of sequesters, the NAEP test in civics was canceled this year. And so we will not have up-to-date data on how students are doing nationally in civics. But 4 years ago, when the NAEP was conducted, we learned some pretty astonishing facts and figures, including the fact that only 25% of 8th graders were able to correctly identify the purpose of the Bill of Rights. Those sorts of details are quite shocking to congressional offices, and you can use them to good effect. Again, you'll want to think about how you're going to explain this. I'm going to lay out a fair amount of information, and you are likely to have, at the very most, 30 minutes with a staff person if they're really interested and engaged in this. More likely you'll have 15 or 20 minutes. And so you'll want to sort of make some notes for yourself ahead of time going into these meetings and think about how you and anybody else that might be joining you in that meeting, if you're tag teaming, how you're going to present this information and move through it in an efficient way that allows you to answer all of the questions that a staff person might have and only takes 15 or 20 minutes. So after you've laid out a little bit about the importance of the social studies, we would like to ask for some help around the language that was in the 2014 appropriations report. So we have been asking for funding for civic education and American history education, and we did not get that language exactly the way we wanted it in the 2014 appropriations bill. The good news is that there was a shout out to civic learning for the first time in 4 years in an appropriations bill, in the bill that was passed in January. And what that report said was that the SEED program, which is an effective educators program, could use its funding to fund national nonprofit applications to elevate teaching of the social studies, specifically civic education. So that was really good news and very exciting and definitely a win, because Congress was looking for a way to provide some funding for the social studies when no social studies education program has been funded for the last 4 years. The shout out to SEED is not uncomplicated, however. The SEED program is a large competitive grant, and it is designed for very, very large nonprofits to get quite large grants to develop effective educators. So, for example, Teach for America has been funded several years through the SEED program. There are 2 criteria in the SEED program that will make it very difficult for civic education or social studies entities to submit a qualifying application. The first criterion that we're worried about is the definition of a national nonprofit, which is that they have to have offices, essentially, in at least 45 states. It's not enough to have a program running in 45 states. And while the organization that applies for the funding can have partnerships with other programs, offices or personnel that your partner might have in states where you don't have an operation do not count towards your 45. So this is clearly a grant program that is designed for very, very large nonprofits. And we don't actually have nonprofits in the field of civic learning that we think are likely to be able to meet these criteria. We're concerned. The second criterion that is of concern to us is that the standard for demonstrating evidence that your program works is very, very high. We have a lot of evidence, a lot of research in civic learning demonstrating what elements need to be in a civic learning program in order for it to be effective. What we don't have is much independent, random control trial type evaluation that are not paid for by a particular program to test different pedagogical approaches to teaching civic learning and demonstrate their effectiveness. Our field just is not richly funded enough to run to those kinds of independent, rigorous evaluations. So we have a lot of evidence about what works, and programs can demonstrate that they are steeped in what we know works, but we don't have independent evaluations that demonstrate effectiveness at the level that is demanded by this program. So we would like to talk to people who are concerned about civic education and ask them to be in touch with the Department of Education and encourage the Department of Education, now that the budget for the SEED program has been expanded, to take another look at their criteria and, without lowering the bar for quality, examine whether the existing criteria are going to make it difficult or impossible for civic learning entities to successfully compete for these funds. And in light of the congressional shout-out, we'd like them to consider revising the criteria to make it possible for civic learning entities to qualify. Did I hear somebody with a question?
Kat, I was wondering if an organization that has affiliates in over 45 states would qualify.
So the language is fairly narrow, and we've been looking at it closely, in particular to see if the American Bar Association and its law-related education program could qualify. And I have not spoken directly to the folks at the Bar Association, but in talking to people who have spoken with the Bar Association folks, there are some concerns about whether even the Bar Association and its law-related education program could qualify. So it's a fairly technical definition, and to give you a definitive answer about whether affiliates count or not, I'd have to know more about the specific affiliate relationship that you're talking about and compare it to the SEED grant criteria. The SEED program has a website on the Department of Education's website. It has quite a lot of information, including total budgets, the organizations that have won awards in the past. And if you're interested in learning more about this, I would encourage you to go to the Department of Education SEED website and take a careful look at it. You can find the criteria for the SEED program there. So we will be putting together, we'll distribute to you, an outline of a draft letter that a congressional office that cares about this could send to the Department of Education. And so you'll have both talking points on this that lays out briefly what I just said, and then also a draft letter that you could leave with a congressional office for them to consider sending to the Secretary of Education. So I know this is complicated, and we have not talked about the SEED program very much in the past because it was not a vehicle that we particularly wanted for social studies education for all the reasons that I just talked about. Are there any other questions about the SEED program before I go on to talk about appropriations in 2015? Hearing none. Then the third thing that we want to be talking about in the congressional offices is appropriations for 2015. We've done a couple of webinars in the last couple of months talking about the appropriations cycle and how that works and what the timing is. And just as a quick reminder, congressional offices will be submitting their requests for programs that they would like to have funded between now and the first week of April. So your visits are extremely timely, and it's a great time for you to be going in and talking to congressional offices about funding that is needed in 2015. The offices send their letters to the chairman and ranking members of the Appropriations Committee. They will be working between now and September to put together their suggested bills for how funding should be allocated. And then sometime in September or October, the House and Senate should be getting together to conference a bill and come up with agreement, if the process works the way it's supposed to, and come up with one bill that they can send to the president for signature. For the last several years, we have been requesting $30 million in a program called FIE, Fund for the Improvement of Education, for teaching history, and $30 million for teaching civic learning. And actually, I apologize, I have a typo on this slide. It says $30 million for social studies, but it should say $30 million for history and $30 million for civic learning. We have been pushing those requests because those are the two aspects of social studies that Congress has been most receptive to. It is not that we feel that geography and economics are unimportant, but civic learning was funded at about $30 million before the earmark was eliminated, and history was funded at more than that before the earmark was eliminated. And we think that we have the strongest case to make for the restoration of funding in history and civic education. The reason we're asking for it in the Fund for the Improvement of Education is because it's a fairly broad program, and it has wide latitude to the Department of Education to fund grants that promote the quality of education. And so we don't need a change in authorizing language in order for FIE funds to go out for history and civics. In the last appropriation cycle, as we know, they did not provide funding for civics or history in FIE. Instead, they did the shout out in SEED. And we want to walk a careful line between being grateful for the shout out in the SEED program, but also explaining why there are some challenges and why we would prefer for funding to go out under the Fund for the Improvement of Education. And the basic reason we would prefer it in FIE is because multiple national nonprofits would be able to apply for funding. They could fund, with $30 million, they could fund multiple different approaches to improving teaching in history and civics, and then local areas, schools, regions would be able to look at the options that were funded by FIE and choose to engage in the program that they thought best met their local needs. So we feel that FIE is more suited to the types of organizations that are engaged in history and civic education, and that's why we would prefer funding under FIE instead of SEED. So we will continue to ask for funding in FIE, again, while being grateful for and acknowledging the shout-out that was in SEED, and also helping Congress to understand the challenges that will make it difficult for us to successfully compete for funding in the SEED program. So we are not expecting any movement in the Elementary and Secondary Education Act this calendar year. We do have some precedent in the work that has been done on ESEA thus far, with new authorizing language in the Senate bill that would create a program of national significance for civic learning that is, unlike the SEED approach, a new program that we think would really work for the field in civic learning. That program of national significance in civics was written by Wyoming Republican Senator Enzi, and included by Iowa Democratic Health Committee Chairman Harkin of Iowa in his ESEA reauthorization bill last year. And that language creates competitive grants to nonprofits to improve the teaching of civics, particularly in underserved communities. We like that language. It's bipartisan language. It was written by a Republican. We want to talk about that language and encourage people to support it, because if ESEA does not pass by the end of this calendar year, which it won't, the bill will die at the end of this Congress, and January will bring the start of a new Congress, and we're going to have new legislation. And we would like any Elementary and Secondary Education Act reauthorization that moves forward to carry the NZ-Harkin Programs of National Significance language. That language mirrors very, very closely the Sandra Day O'Connor Act that is bipartisan language in the House. The NZ-Harkin language is in the Senate ESEA bill. The civic learning language that we like is not included in the House ESEA bill. The legislation that carries the language we like is the Sandra Day O'Connor Act in the House. That is bipartisan legislation. We have not added any Republican co-sponsors to it in quite a while, and we would like to see if we could get additional co-sponsors. The reason we want additional co-sponsors for the Sandra Day O'Connor Act is it's a marker, it's a reminder, and it makes a stronger case for us next year when the committee is writing the big bill. It makes a stronger case that they ought to include the Sandra Day O'Connor Act provisions. The other element that is in the Sandra Day O'Connor Act, beyond the grants to national organizations teaching civics, is the expansion of the NAEP in civics. The NAEP test is the only NAEP for a core subject in No Child Left Behind that is not administered to a large enough sample size to be able to be disaggregated by state. So there is no way for us to know how California is doing compared to New York or Texas or Washington or Colorado, because we only have national data. And as I mentioned before, due to sequester, the civics test that was to be administered this year was actually canceled. And so we have no information, no current information about civics and how students are doing on it right now. So the Sandra Day O'Connor Act would call on Congress to expand the sample size for the NAEP in civics so that we would be able to get information that could be disaggregated by state, and we'd have more knowledge of how students in particular states and regions are doing. So those are the four areas that we want to touch on and ask for Congress's help. And as you're doing this, I think that it's important to include local examples, to relate your requests back to what's going on in your region, and connect it to home for the staff and members that you may be seeing. The folks who came into town last summer for the State Leadership Institute did an excellent job of doing that. And one of the things that they were told by multiple congressional offices that I just want to give you a heads up to, many offices responded that they should not need to provide additional funding that is specifically for teaching civics, because you could use Title I money for schools with disadvantaged students to pay for social studies. So they don't need to give us any money that's specifically for social studies, because schools could use Title I money to pay for that in areas where they have high numbers of economically disadvantaged kids. I want to bring that to your attention because it's basically an excuse. It may be true that Title I money can be used for teaching social studies, However, that Title I money is in very short supply, and it is already claimed for many other aspects of education. And in particular, most Title I money is going into making sure that kids can pass the NCLB required tests in English language literacy and math. So while it may be true that Title I is an allowable use for teaching social studies, there is no extra money in Title I lying around to be used to teach social studies, particularly when schools are not evaluated on student proficiency in social studies, and they are evaluated and judged and potentially penalized based on their students' proficiency in language arts and math. One particularly memorable and powerful example of how loosey-goosey the requirements for social studies are was offered up by a teacher who talked in the debrief after the State Leadership Institute about how in her school there is a requirement for 8th graders to take social studies, which is a good thing. The bad news is that they can meet their social studies requirements by volunteering to do administrative paperwork in the front office one day a week. And basically the school is so short on funding for secretarial jobs that students can meet their civic education, their social studies requirements by doing volunteer work in the front office. It's a really devastating and damning comment on the state of social studies education in that school, and was very impactful when it was used in congressional meetings, and certainly stuck with all of the teachers and folks, including myself, who heard that example at the SLI. So please do use local examples from your school, your district, your state that help give added context and color to what Justice O'Connor calls the crisis in civic education. So I'm going to stop there and open this up for comments, for questions, for suggestions. There are folks on this webinar who have done this several years in a row now, and would love to hear your insights, your recommendations based on your experience doing this other years that might benefit your colleagues who have not done it before.
A question from Anton Schultz, who tells me that he is in class right now and that he wonders if you address this, Kat, but he's saying that his congressman is very conservative and is not a fan of the Department of Education. Even though I doubt there will be much support, are there specific suggestions? I may not be able to listen to the response now, but we'll catch it on the recording later. Thanks.
The person that you're talking to is not unique in feeling suspicious about Secretary Duncan and the Department of Education, and there's been quite a lot of controversy around some of the things that the Department of Education has done. So the way that the Sandra Day O'Connor Act would fund civic learning activities is it would allow multiple national organizations that have an evidence-based approach to teaching civics to apply for funding and receive funding to improve instruction in the field of civics nationwide. It would then be up to individual schools and school districts to look at what is essentially a menu of validated approaches and choose the one that fits best for that school and that community's needs. So while the funding would be coming from the Department of Education, what is important to emphasize is it is not the Department of Education telling any school or school district or state what it has to do, what curriculum to use, what approach it should take. The Department of Education would be funding a menu of options and it would be local school districts and schools that would be choosing the option that best fits that community's needs. So I think what we want to emphasize is while the funding would come from the Department of Education, the choice and the control would be in the hands of local schools and school districts. So I hope that is helpful.
So I did look on Congressman Lambert's website because Anton had asked additional questions, and I'm glad he was asking here as well to get your feedback on that. The congressman believes in block grants. Is there any connection that can be established, any link to how the funding provided by the Department of Ed could act as a block grant? I think you just mentioned something in regards to that, but is there anything else that might strengthen that connection for that congressman? That's one question. And the other is, he is very much a believer in charter schools. Is there any particular benefit that could be attached to the professional development funds offered by SEED to the benefit of those charter school teachers specifically?
So when we talk about the need for civic education, that applies equally in traditional public schools and charter schools. And there's nothing in anything that we do or talk about that would either that would say that charter schools could not participate. Depending on where you are, if it is typically schools in disadvantaged neighborhoods with high numbers of economically disadvantaged kids that are being converted to charter schools, you could argue that charter schools might actually disproportionately be able to take advantage of this funding, because the funding that we're talking about for civic education, whether it's in the Program of National Significance or the Sandra Day O'Connor Act, is really focused on making sure that disadvantaged students who are underrepresented in civic education classes now would be engaged. So again, to the extent that our civic learning efforts are focused on kids who are underrepresented in civic learning classes, and those are the same group of students who might be overrepresented in charter schools, you could argue that charter schools would disproportionately benefit from this funding. That logic only holds if you have a disproportionate number of charter schools serving disadvantaged kids, which is true in some states, it's not true in other states. Regarding block grants, I can only give you this background information, and I think folks will have to think about how to present it most effectively. There are many members of Congress who believe in local control and who believe that we should block grant all education funds to states and let states choose how to use them. Our experience is that because the social studies is not tested and schools are not evaluated on student proficiency in the social studies, when you give schools a block grant, they use the resources in the subject areas where they are testing and where their performance is evaluated. And our experience has been that block granting civic education and social studies funding, along with funds for teaching other subject areas, means that all of the resources are dedicated to math and English language, and the social studies does not get funded. There's another issue and concern about giving state funding for basically having each state take its own approach to civics and social studies. If you give each state funding that is intended to be used for each of the subjects, and let's say that you require states to teach civic education or social studies, it is very inefficient to have each state go off and develop its own criteria, its own approach, its own curriculum to teach social studies. And one of the things that we've learned the hard way is that one size does not fit all. That different students with different needs, rural, urban, English as a second language, learning disabilities, different students respond to different approaches to teaching all subjects, including the social studies. Let's take a really big state, New York, Texas, California. Even if they got a fairly large pot of money to teach social studies, they are not going to be able to have enough to develop multiple approaches to teaching social studies that meet the needs of different students. If the state of California, the state of Texas, the state of New York got funding for teaching the social studies, the best that they would be able to do is one curriculum or one approach. The advantage of the approach taken by the Sandra Day O'Connor Act, where there is a menu of options that meet the needs of different students, and schools can choose the option off the menu that best meets their needs, it's highly efficient. It acknowledges that one size does not fit all, but it means that states are not reinventing each other's wheels. It creates a marketplace of approaches and then empowers schools and states to choose the ones that work best for them. So the approach that was taken by the Sandra Day O'Connor Act is not consistent with a Republican focus on block grants, but it is very consistent with a Republican focus, a conservative focus on empowering communities, empowering schools, having multiple options, allowing the marketplace to determine which ones are most successful, and getting away from a one-size-fits-all. A one-size-fits-all determined by the state is no more successful than a one-size-fits-all determined by the federal government. But we can agree that with a menu of options that have been validated as being effective for different communities, it's important for communities to be able to choose. And I hope we could all agree that it's really important for students to learn to be instructed effectively in the social studies, because we live in a democracy where we trust voters with really important decisions. So I'm going to get off my soapbox. That is the Republican argument that I have used in conservative offices with varying levels of success. And I would also just remind folks, if there's somebody who's wedded to block grants and adamantly opposed to tying funding to particular subjects, you in one or even 2 or 3 meetings will not be able to turn that office around. And that will be an unrealistic goal for the month of March 2014. But it is a realistic goal to give them a different perspective, to give them a different way to think about this, to give them a new way to think about this that might reduce their opposition to tying funding specifically to the teaching of the social studies, and it might give you another door to have another conversation a couple of months from now. Don't think of this as your one opportunity to make everybody you talk to a champion for social studies. Think about this as one step in the process. And it might be that the best you can do is give some people something new to think about, reduce their opposition to tying funding to the teaching of the social studies, even if you don't make them a champion for this overnight. So have realistic expectations for what you can do in one meeting in certain offices.
Thank you, Kat. That's so very helpful. I have one other question on behalf of one of our other members who will be visiting Senator Harkin's office. And given his role, a very supportive role in the past, is there a particular angle that she should be using, or a particular area where she should be spending most of her time and bringing attention to our ask?
Yes, excellent question. So, for example, in a congressional office where they're really opposed to, they're big fans of block grants and they're really opposed to tying funding to the social studies, you might not want to spend as much time talking about SEED because they might not be that interested in sending a letter to Secretary Duncan. In Harkin's office, he was the author of the Programs of National Significance. He is the chairman of both the funding subcommittee and the authorizing subcommittee that writes how these programs work. We would really love to have Senator Harkin send the letter to Secretary Duncan, because of all of the members of Congress, a letter from Senator Harkin on the SEED topic will be highly impactful. So you don't need to talk as much about ESEA reauthorization with that office, because he's already done what we need him to do. Make sure you say thank you for the Programs of National Significance, but he's done as much as he can do for us on ESEA. You would want to spend more time saying thank you for the SEED language, but also talking about some of the challenges and talking to his staff about sending that letter. So in that office, that would certainly be the place to focus.
Excellent. Thank you. I think she will find that very helpful. Any other questions from anyone else? Hearing none, I wanted to give a plug in for the future webinars that we're doing, the legislative webinars that we're doing with Pat, and the upcoming tentative topics. Our goal is to touch upon all sorts of specific areas and topics that will benefit our advocacy efforts and will increase your knowledge about all sorts of aspects and perspectives into our advocacy efforts. At any rate, those are that, and wanted to thank Kat for such a wonderful presentation and very helpful one. And we're having the next webinar for the legislative advocacy series on March 19th at 3 p.m. East Coast time. So you're all welcome to attend that one as well. It will be an appropriations request and all sorts of ins and outs within that process. Thank you so much. Kat, is there anything else?
And your Hill visits. I hope you enjoy them and learn a lot and come out of them energized to keep talking to your congressional offices.
Thank you so much, and everyone have a good afternoon, and we're looking forward to seeing you at the board meeting. Also, one more thing before everyone leaves. I'm being asked by Michelle Herzog to remind everyone to save the dates for SLI. The dates right now are July 8th to July 10th on 2014, and more details should be forthcoming.